Hi, my name is Dear Tiagi, and in this video, I'll be going over AP Bio Unit 1, the Chemistry of Life. And to start, I want to give a broad overview of what this unit is all about. So as the name suggests, this unit is all about the chemistry of life, which basically means we'll be focusing on the four major biological macromolecules and their structure, function, etc., giving a broad overview, which will then expand in later units. We'll also be focusing on some basic chemistry and some important molecules, like water, which are important to biological functions and processes. So to start, as I said, water is a very important function to life. And the basic chemical thing you need to know about water is that it is polar. And the reason why is we think of water, right, H2O, so we have an oxygen molecule, which is way bigger than the hydrogen molecules here. Because oxygen is way bigger, it's more electronegative, which means it wants to take the electrons, because right, these are covalently bonded, which means they share the electrons. And because oxygen is so much bigger, it kind of wants to take those electrons and take it to its side, leaving hydrogen with less electrons. And because of this, we say that the hydrogen is slightly polar and the oxygen is slightly negative. So the symbol I wrote here is the Greek symbol lowercase delta, and you might remember delta from math. It just basically says that we have a little change in positivity here and a little change in negativity here. So because of this polarity, right, we have this interesting property called hydrogen bonding, which really allows for a lot of properties of life and a lot of functions of life to occur because of hydrogen bonding. And the idea with hydrogen bonding is we have, let's say we have a water molecule here, so HOH. The idea is that we're going to have, these are covalent bonds, right, the straight lines. We're going to have a small attraction between this hydrogen, which again is a little bit positive, and another oxygen, which is slightly negative, and this is going to create a hydrogen bond. And so this hydrogen bond is a attraction, or kind of like a bond, weak bond, between two water molecules. And so this type of bonding between two water molecules leads to one of our fundamental properties, which is cohesion. So cohesion is basically the property of water where water molecules like to stick together and stay together. So for example, if you have a coin and you put droplets of water, what you're going to see is you're going to see the coin create kind of like a dome of water. And this is because of the hydrogen bonds, right? They're bonded together and they want to stay together, which is why we have this kind of dome on top of the penny or the coin. We also see the attraction or the property of adhesion, which is the property where water molecules, because they're slightly polar, like to go with other polar molecules. So, for example, let's say, I can't think of an example, but if we have a water molecule and we have a polar molecule, they're likely to come together and be attracted because of adhesion. This also leads us into the topic of hydrophobic and hydrophilic particles. So hydrophilic solutes, which we call them, like to dissolve in water. So as you can see in the word, philic means love, hydro means water, so it likes to dissolve in water. And so this means that it's like kind of like a great solvent, right? So water is considered to be like a universal solvent in some cases because it's able to dissolve a lot of kind of like polar hydrophilic molecules because it's polar. So it's able to take out, use its polarity to kind of like break apart the solute and dissolve it. Versus hydrophobic, which is nonpolar, and obviously, to be the opposite, doesn't dissolve in water, so it does not dissolve. So other properties of water, water expands on freezing, and this is because the hydrogen bonds that form when water is freezing cause it to expand in volume, which makes it less dense, which then makes it expand, become more less dense. We also have the property of evaporative cooling, which basically is the property that when water evaporates, it cools whatever surface it was on. So which is why we sweat. When we sweat and water is evaporated from our sweat, we get cooler because of evaporative cooling. Water also has a high surface tension, and this makes sense because if you imagine water, right? If you imagine like a lake, on top of this lake, we're gonna have all these hydrogen bonds, these water, together in these bonds, and so these bonds are gonna create a surface tension, which kind of prevents, which kind of allows like molecules and stuff to flow on it because of the surface tension. Water also has a high heat of vaporization, which basically means it takes a lot of heat to vaporize or evaporate water, and it also has a high specific heat. And this basically means that water is able to absorb a lot of heat and a lot of energy without increasing its temperature, which helps us with things like temperature regulation, right? So instead of overheating, because of water, we're able to kind of absorb that heat without increasing the temperature. Water also helps us with things like nutrient transportation. Wow. So nutrient transportation basically relies on cohesion and adhesion between the actual tubes that carry the water and the water molecules themselves that transport water. So for example, in trees, in transpiration, water is able to travel up the roots, up against gravity, because of cohesion and adhesion. And it also helps water with cell, your environment, and biological processes, because again, it's a good solvent, and it's just really good for keeping molecules in place. So that's water, which is a very, again, important molecule for life. Next, let's go into the elements of life. So the main elements of life, well, the first thing is that you need to know that in biology, the structure of a molecule leads to its function. So if you have a different structure, you're going to have a different function for that molecule. So all of life is made of organic compounds. So organic compounds are compounds that have carbon in them and usually have C, although the only requirement to be organic is that it has a carbon. And so the main really fundamental molecules for life are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And sometimes we call this chnops. And these are really the main kind of elements that make up life. Next, I'll go into the functional groups, which are basically these groups. So life, again, is made out of carbon and usually hydrogen. And so it's made a lot of times out of these things called hydrocarbon chains. So hydrocarbon chains are basically these chains of carbons attached to each other, and they're surrounded by hydrogens. So a carbon atom can, again, have 4 bonds. And so we basically have this chain like so. And so with these hydrocarbon bonds, what happens is to make different molecules and have different functions, we change the structure by adding these things called functional groups. And so functional groups are basically these common types of structural molecules that change the structure or the change function of a compound. And so the main types of functional groups you'll need to know are things like hydroxyl, which is basically just a oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. You need to know carbonyl, which is just a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. A amino group or an amine group, which is a nitrogen bonded to 2 hydrogens. A carboxyl group, which is similar to carbonyl, except it has, again, double bond to oxygen, but also bond to hydrogen. There's also methyl, which is a carbon bonded to 3 hydrogens. Sulfhydryl, which as the name suggests, is a sulfur bonded to a hydrogen. And finally, phosphate is kind of the last kind of molecule that you need to know, or functional group you need to know. And this is a phosphate bonded to 4 oxygens, and 2 of the oxygens are negatively charged, which is why we're able to have more than 4 bonds. Okay, so those are the basic organic compounds and some functional groups. Now let's go into the 4 macromolecules. So the 4 biological macromolecules that you need to know, the 4 macromolecules that you need to know all have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them. So they all have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the 4 molecules are carbohydrates, which only consists of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Lipids, which sometimes, in addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, sometimes have phosphate. Sometimes, right? Proteins, which have a nitrogen and sometimes have a sulfur. And nucleic acids, which have a nitrogen and a phosphorus. And so carbon, proteins, and nucleic acids are all polymers, which basically means that they're these long molecules made of smaller subsections called monomers. So basically, you can think of it like Legos. So we have these Lego monomers, and when you combine them together, you get these polymers, which are these components. And the way we construct these polymers is through the process called dehydration synthesis. And dehydration synthesis basically is a process where if we have, let's say, some molecule here, right, and we have a hydrogen attached to the molecule, and we have another molecule here, right, called molecule B, attached to a hydroxyl group, what happens is we take this hydrogen and hydroxyl, we remove it, creating water, and then we are able to combine the A and B together. And so we're able to form polymers using dehydration synthesis. Now the opposite to break polymers is called hydrolysis. And it's basically literally the opposite of this process. So we have a water molecule, we have two polymer, right, A and B. We add water, right, and then so it breaks the molecule because the A molecule is going to bond with the hydrogen, and the B molecule is going to bond with the hydroxyl. And that's called hydrolysis. Okay, so now let's take a deeper look into each of the four macromolecules. So again, this is just an overview, right? Unit 1 is really just an overview of these macromolecules, and we'll be talking more in depth about what they are and what they do in later units. So first we have carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are in the ratio of 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen, and they're made of these things called monosaccharides. Right, so again, carbohydrates are polymers, so monosaccharides create polysaccharides, and they function as short-term energy and kind of like the building block of materials. So they kind of have a multi-functional purpose. So four types, I guess. Carbohydrates you need to know are storage carbohydrates, which again store energy. And so examples are glycogen in animals, and you've probably heard of this one, starch, in plants. And we also have structural carbohydrates. And in plants, this comes in the form of cellulose. And in animals, we have chitin. And structural, so for example, if we look at glucose, which is a type of monosaccharide, glucose comes in two forms. We have a alpha form. Right, in the alpha form, if we draw the 6-carbon sugar, the alpha form, the linkages are going to be the hydroxyl are going to be on the same side, right? So if we draw another one, the hydroxyl groups are all on the same side, and this is called the alpha linkage. So alpha linkages kind of create a coiled structure. So storage molecules have alpha linkages. Meanwhile, the opposite are beta linkages. So beta linkages, if we imagine like so, the glucose molecule, the hydroxyl group alternates. So kind of alternates position like that. And this kind of causes like a linear structure that we see in these types of molecules. So alpha goes to storage, beta goes to structural. Next, let's go into lipids. So lipids are not polymers, right? While the other three are polymers, lipids are not polymers, and they are nonpolar. So they're nonpolar and not polymers, and they're usually made out of a glycerol, which is a 3-carbon alcohol, and they're made of these things called fatty acid tails, which is fatty acid chains. Sometimes it's going to be made of 1, 2, 3, whatever. If it's 3, it's called a triglyceride, or whatever. It can be made of however many fatty acid chains. And the goal of these, well, first of all, what is fatty acid chain? It's basically a long hydrocarbon chain with a carboxyl group. And the goal of lipids is to provide long-term energy and to store long-term energy. And so we have two types of lipids. We have saturated lipids and we have unsaturated lipids or fats, right? So unsaturated has double bonds, and the structure is bent, and at room temperature, it comes as a liquid. So for example, olive oil is an unsaturated fat. And so if we look at the structure, right, the hydrocarbon, this is our fatty acid tail, what we're going to have is we're going to have a double bond, and this double bond is going to cause some kind of like bend, like that. So it's like kind of crinked, like so. Meanwhile, for saturated, we only have single bonds, right? So unsaturated, if there's one double bond in the hydrocarbon chain, it's unsaturated. But with saturated, we have only single bonds, it's linear, and at room temperature, it's solid. This example is butter. Butter is a saturated lipid, fat. Next, an example of a lipid, another lipid, is a steroid, which consists of 4 carbon rings. And steroids function for our growth and metabolism. An example of a lipid is cholesterol, which is found in animal cell membranes. And cholesterol is important for like hormonal and cell-to-cell communication stuff, but too much cholesterol can obviously not be good for your health. And finally, one other important type of lipid you need to know is this thing called a phospholipid. So phospholipids are really important for cells, and a phospholipid is made of glycerol, right? So 3-carbon alcohol, a phosphate head, so a phosphate group, and 2 fatty acid chains. And so how a phospholipid looks, it has a, this is where the glycerol and the phosphate head goes, and then we have 2 fatty acid tails like so. And the idea is that this top part is going to be polar, and these fatty acid chains, again, are just hydrogen and carbon, so they're going to be nonpolar. And so they're important for cells, these phospholipids, because when we put them together, right, so we have these phospholipids, and in the cell, we're going to have this membrane made out of phospholipids. So you can imagine we have something like this, right, and all around it is water. So what happens is we have a structure that looks something like this, like a sandwich, right? So on the outside, we have these polar molecules, which are facing the water because they're polar, and on the inside, we have these nonpolar sections, which are kind of shielded from the water by the polar sections. And so if you create a circle, this kind of creates the membrane or the layer outside of the cell, this phospholipid. So phospholipids are really important for cells. Next, let's go into nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are polymers, and their monomers are called nucleotides. So nucleic acids made of nucleotide monomers. And nucleotide monomers function basically with a phosphate group, right? So they have one phosphate group. They have a pentose sugar, which means a 5-carbon sugar. And they have a nitrogenous base. And so the function of nucleic acids is basically to encode genetic info via genes. And so we have main two types of nucleic acids. We have DNA, which is made of this thing called deoxyribose sugar. And we have RNA, which is made of ribose sugar. And so there's a lot of differences between DNA and RNA, but the main differences are the DNA is double helixed, while RNA is single-stranded. And DNA is really just for encoding genetic info, while RNA is much more versatile and used for many other things. And DNA was also made of the proteins ATCG, while RNA is made of AUCG. And these proteins, so if we have a kind of DNA strand, the linkages in between are between A and T, C and G, example like that, AT, GC, whatever, right? And so these are what actually encode genetic info, these connections in their order. And so basically AT forms 2 hydrogen bonds together, and AT come together, CG comes together. It can't be AC, it's AT and CG, AU and CG. And then CG forms 3 hydrogen bonds together. And that's really all you need to know for nucleic acids. Again, we'll be going into much more depth in future units, but it's kind of all you need to know for this chapter. And finally, we'll go over proteins. So proteins are also monomers, and they're made of amino acid monomers. Sorry, they're polymers, and they're made of amino acid monomers. And these monomers come together to form polypeptide chains. And so we have different types of degrees or structural degrees for proteins. So the first degree is the primary structure, which is just a sequence of amino acid monomers. Second degree is called the second degree, right? And this is when we start to have some kind of folding going on because of the hydrogen and carboxyl groups, and they start to have hydrogen bonds together, which kind of causes this folding to occur, which creates these things called the A helices, right? So we have these kind of like helix-looking things, and these beta sheets to form. Second structure, primary structure is just a linear chain of amino acids. Secondary structure, we start to see some interactions and hydrogen bonding occurring, forming these helices and beta sheets. Then in the third degree, we have tertiary structure. This is when we start to get a 3D structure. So we start to see the R groups interacting, right, which form this 3D structure. And then the fourth degree is called quaternary. And this is when we have multiple polypeptides. So we have multiple of these tertiary structures come together to form a single protein. So example is hemoglobin. So it's example of a quaternary structure protein. And yeah. So it's really hard to predict protein folding, which is why, because again, there's so many interactions and so many factors that change how a protein folds. And so amino acids, the main structure of an amino acid is we have a central carbon connected to a hydrogen, connected to an amine group, so NH2, connected to a carboxyl, so COOH, connected to an R group. And this R group is what makes every protein kind of different and variate. So there's 20 different groups, and depending on what the group is, it kind of changes its behavior and polarity, how it folds. So if you have a carbon or hydrogen group in this R group, you're going to be kind of nonpolar. But then if you have like a sulfur or nitrogen, you're going to be polar. And again, these R groups is what change the second, third, and fourth structure. They kind of affect how the protein folds. And finally, what are proteins useful for? Proteins do a lot of stuff in terms of cellular and biological processes. So proteins are the worker molecules, which means they kind of like started creating stuff and helping to build cells. They're also used for enzymes to speed up reactions. They're used as a defensive kind of thing as well. They're used for storage, transport, hormonal, receptor, structural, etc. So really the best way to describe is as the worker molecule of biology. They really just do kind of all. And yeah, those are the 4 major macromolecules plus water, which is really all you need to know for AP Biology Unit 1 Chemistry of Life. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow. Bye.